I keep forgetting to drink it while I try to figure out how to begin. I've told pieces of this story before, to a therapist, to my sister, to one late-night friend in a diner booth after everyone else had gone home, but I've never tried to tell the whole of it in one breath. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to try to tell you what it was like to grow up not fitting into the shape people expected me to fit, and how a private habit that began with something as small as a borrowed sweater ended up becoming a decades-long conversation with myself about who I actually am. I want to be clear before I even really start. This isn't a story designed to shock you. There's nothing here about scandal or spectacle. It's a story about a person slowly learning to be honest and about the very ordinary, very human cost of not being honest for a long time. If any part of what I say lines up with something you felt but haven't had words for, I hope it helps. If it doesn't line up with your life at all, I hope it at least helps you understand somebody in your life a little better. That's really the only reason I'm speaking. I grew up in a small town in the middle of a state most people fly over. Our house was at the end of a road that turned to gravel about a quarter mile before you reached us, and the porch light was always on because my mother believed strangers deserved to find their way even if they'd taken a wrong turn. My father worked at a factory that made industrial fans, the kind that go into warehouses and grain silos, and my mother did the books for a veterinary clinic 2 towns over. I had one older sister, Marin, who was 4 years ahead of me and treated me like a project she'd been assigned in school. She dressed me up in her old Halloween costumes when I was 3, she taught me how to tie my shoes when I was 5, and she was the first person I ever felt safe around who wasn't my mother. I mention all this because I want you to understand that the household I grew up in was not cruel. It wasn't the kind of place you read about in memoirs where the child is bracing themselves at the door every night. My parents loved me. They came to my school plays. They fed me hot food. What they didn't have was a language for what I was going through because I didn't have that language either, and neither did anyone in the town, and neither, honestly, did most of the world back then. So the silence in my childhood wasn't malicious. It was just the shape of the room I was standing in. The first time I remember noticing something was different, I couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Marin had a school dance and had spent an entire Saturday afternoon getting ready with a friend in her bedroom. There was hairspray in the hallway and a smell of something floral drifting under the door, and I remember standing outside that door for a long time, not wanting to interrupt, but not wanting to leave either. When she finally came out, she was wearing a pale blue dress with a little ribbon at the waist, and something about the way she moved, like she had grown 2 inches taller, and was suddenly aware of her own hands, hit me in a place I didn't understand. I wasn't jealous of the attention. I wasn't envious of her friend. It was much quieter than that. It was more like recognizing a landmark I'd never actually been to, like seeing a photograph of a house you've dreamed about and thinking, oh, so that's where I live. I didn't do anything with that feeling. I was 6. I went back to my room and read the same book about a dog and a boy that I'd read 100 times. But the feeling didn't leave. It just filed itself away and waited. School for the first several years was uneventful. I was a quiet kid, the kind teachers described as thoughtful because they couldn't think of a more specific word. I had friends, but not a best friend. I played sports because my father took me to sign-ups, and I was decent at them, but never great because I never really cared enough to be great. What I cared about were books and drawing, and a particular kind of afternoon light in the fall that made everything look like it was underlined. When I got a little older, maybe 10 or 11, I started noticing that the other boys were changing in ways I wasn't. They were getting louder. They were starting to see the world as something to be won. They punched each other on the shoulder as a form of hello, and I found the whole ritual exhausting and slightly frightening. I remember being at a birthday party for a boy in my class, and all of us were sitting on the floor in his basement, and one of the older brothers came down and said something crude about a girl in our grade, and every other boy in the room laughed like they'd been given permission. I laughed too, because I didn't know what else to do, but I remember the way my face felt while I did it, hot and strange and wrong, like I was borrowing a voice that didn't belong to me. That kind of moment happened a lot. I got very good at wearing a voice. Around 12, I started borrowing things. That's the honest word for it, borrowing, though I didn't ask, and I wouldn't have known how to ask. Marin was in high school by then, and had begun accumulating a wardrobe that seemed to me impossibly grown up. She had a soft gray cardigan that she'd left draped over her desk chair one afternoon while she was out with friends, and I put it on for maybe 90 seconds in her empty bedroom, standing in front of her closet mirror. 90 seconds. And I want to be careful with how I describe what happened, because I don't want to make it sound bigger or smaller than it was. What happened was that my shoulders dropped. That's the best way I can put it. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my shoulders somewhere up around my ears for years. In that cardigan, in that mirror, for 90 seconds, they came down, and I could breathe in a way I hadn't been aware I couldn't. Then I heard the front door, and I put it back exactly where it had been, and I went in my own room and lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what had just happened. I didn't have a word for it. I thought maybe I was sick. I thought maybe I was going crazy in some small, quiet way that other people would notice eventually. What I didn't think, because it was not a thought available to me yet, was that maybe I had just met a version of myself for the first time. That first borrowing turned into more borrowings over the next couple of years. All of them careful, all of them brief, all of them followed by a kind of panic that would keep me awake at night. It wasn't the kind of panic that comes from being caught. It was the kind of panic that comes from suspecting there is something inside you that doesn't match the outside of you, and not knowing what to do with that suspicion. I would lie in bed and make deals with a God I wasn't sure I believed in. I promised I would stop. I promised I would be normal. I promised I would be the son my father clearly wanted, the one who liked his own hands, the one who would eventually bring home a girlfriend and talk about trucks. And for weeks at a time, I would keep those promises. I would throw myself into schoolwork and into running, and I'd tell myself I was cured of whatever this was. And then one afternoon I would be alone in the house, and I would pass the door to Marin's room, and something inside me would go very quiet, and I would find myself standing in front of her mirror again, and the cardigan or the scarf or the long skirt she never wore anymore would be back on me, and my shoulders would drop, and I would breathe. That was the pattern for most of my early adolescence. Guilt, then quiet, then guilt again. Puberty made everything more complicated in the way puberty makes everything more complicated. My voice started to change, and I hated it. I hated it more than I could explain to anyone, because how do you explain to your mother that the sound of your own voice makes you want to leave the room? I grew several inches in a single summer, and my father was proud of it, and I hated that too, because every inch felt like it was carrying me farther away from the small, quiet person I had glimpsed in the mirror. There was one particular week when I noticed hair on my chest for the first time, and I stood in the bathroom for 20 minutes staring at it. Not disgusted exactly, but stunned. The way you might be stunned to find that someone had painted graffiti on your house while you slept. I remember thinking very clearly I couldn't stop my chest from changing. I couldn't stop any of it. My body was becoming a house I hadn't chosen and couldn't leave. That's a hard thing to sit with when you're 13. It's a hard thing to sit with when you're any age, really. I want to pause here and say something about mental health because I think it's important and I think it gets skipped a lot in stories like this one. I was not, in those years, a healthy person on the inside. I don't mean I was dangerous, and I don't mean I was falling apart in a way anyone could see. I mean I was carrying a secret that felt too big for me, and I had no one to hand any piece of it to, and the effect of that, over years, was a kind of low-grade sadness that I mistook for my personality. I thought I was just a quiet, serious kid. I thought I was just melancholy by nature. I didn't understand until much later that a lot of what I was calling my personality was actually the shape that unspoken pain had pressed me into. If you're listening to this and you recognize that shape, please hear me. The quietness you think is you might not be you. Some of it might be the weight, and weight can be set down eventually with help. It took me a long time to learn that, and I want to save you some of that time if I can. High school was where the fear got sharper. Up until then, my borrowings had been private and my confusion had been mostly internal. But in high school, the world started demanding that I take a position on who I was. Boys were expected to like certain things and dislike certain other things, and to signal all of this constantly through the clothes they wore and the way they walked and the jokes they tolerated. Girls were expected to do their own version of the same performance. And I was expected to pick a lane and drive in it. I didn't want to pick a lane. I wanted to walk across the field. But walking across the field in a small town in that decade was not a thing you did without consequences. So I performed. I performed hard. I joined the track team, not because I loved running, but because running let me be alone with my thoughts while still counting socially as a boy who did a boy thing. I let a friend set me up with a girl in my grade, a genuinely kind person named Callie, who deserved better than a boyfriend, who was mostly relieved to have a shield. We dated for almost a year. I liked her. I really did. I liked talking to her. I liked the way she made fun of her own laugh. I liked the way she believed in ghosts in a very matter-of-fact way. What I didn't like was the version of me she was dating, because that version of me was mostly a costume, and I knew it, and I felt increasingly guilty about it. When we finally broke up, she was the one who did it, and she was gentle about it, and she said something I have carried with me ever since. She said, "I feel like there's a door in you that you keep closed even when I'm standing right in front of it, and I don't think it's fair to either of us to keep knocking." She was 17 when she said that. I think about her sometimes and hope she's happy. She deserved to be. The rest of high school, I mostly kept to myself. I read a lot. I discovered, in the back corner of the school library, a couple of books that used words I'd never heard before, words for people who felt the way I felt, or something close to it. I remember the first time I encountered the idea on the page that a person might live for years in a body that didn't feel like theirs, and that this wasn't a moral failure or a symptom of insanity, but a real thing that real people navigated. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I closed the book and put it back on the shelf and walked out of the library and did not check the book out, because if I checked it out, my name would be on a slip inside the cover, and my mother might, in some improbable disaster, find that slip. But I went back to that library a lot in the following months. I read carefully. I read scared. I read the way you read a map when you're lost in a place where asking for directions might get you hurt. College was the first time I let myself experiment beyond a borrowed sweater. I chose a university several states away, which I told my parents was about the strength of the program, and which was actually about the distance. In a dorm room I shared with a very nice, very oblivious engineering student named Rob, I started to slowly, carefully assemble a small drawer of things that were mine. A skirt from a thrift store I visited on a Sunday, when the shop was almost empty. A pair of earrings I bought at a mall kiosk from a bored teenager who did not care who I was. A tube of tinted lip balm that I told the cashier was a gift for my sister, though no one had asked. I kept everything in a locked box under my bed, and I only opened it when Rob was gone for the weekend, which was often because Rob had a girlfriend 2 hours away and would disappear from Thursday to Sunday most weeks. Those weekends were the first time in my life I had extended, unwatched hours to sit with the version of me I had only ever glimpsed. I would put on the skirt and the lip balm and the earrings and sit at Rob's desk and do my homework. That's it. That's the whole scandal. I did my homework. I answered emails. I ate cold cereal out of a plastic bowl. And I was happier, in a low, steady way, than I had ever been in my life. It scared me how happy I was. Because if this small, quiet, mundane version of my life was making me this much less exhausted, what did that say about the rest of my life? What did it mean about every other Sunday I'd ever lived when I hadn't been this version of me? Was I supposed to conclude that I'd been half asleep for 18 years? I wasn't ready to conclude that. So I did what a lot of people do when they aren't ready. I compartmentalized. Weekends alone were one country. The rest of my life was another. I kept a passport between them and told no one about the border. I'd like to tell you that college was where I figured everything out, but that would be a lie, and I'm trying not to lie in this. College was where I collected data. I collected words for myself, and then rejected them, and then tried others. I read forums late at night, and closed them quickly if someone walked past my open door. I met, at a coffee shop one October, a person who introduced themselves with a name that clearly wasn't the one on their student ID, and who used pronouns I hadn't heard applied to a real living human being in front of me before. I remember shaking their hand and feeling like I had just crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. We became friends, sort of, not close friends. But they were the first person I ever spent time with who lived openly as themselves, and I watched them the way an apprentice watches a craftsman, trying to figure out how they did the thing they did. What I noticed over the months I knew them was that their life was not glamorous. It was not a triumphant montage. They had a hard job at a bookstore. They had a roommate who left dishes in the sink. They cried once in front of me about a family member who had stopped speaking to them. They were, in other words, a person with a person's life, and the fact that they had chosen honesty about who they were had not made their life easy. It had just made it theirs. That distinction between easy and theirs sank into me slowly over the course of that year. I began to understand that whatever choice I eventually made about myself would not deliver me into a magical life free of problems. It would just deliver me into a life that was actually mine. And I began to wonder, in a way I hadn't quite let myself wonder before, whether a life that was actually mine, with all its attendant difficulties, might be better than the borrowed one I'd been living on the outside of. After college, I moved to a mid-sized city for a job in publishing, which is a fancy way of saying I answered phones and made coffee for people who wrote grant applications. I lived alone for the first time. I had a studio apartment above a laundromat, and the whole place smelled faintly of detergent, and the floor vibrated every time somebody downstairs ran a spin cycle. And in that apartment, for the first time, I started to live at home the way I had only lived on weekends in college. Not in public, not yet. But at home, in the evenings, after the door was locked and the blinds were down, I began to be, at least within four walls, the person I had been rehearsing quietly for 15 years. I started to notice how much less tired I was when I let this happen. My apartment was small and messy, my job was tedious, my paycheck was thin, and yet the ordinary evenings I spent inside that apartment were, on some level I couldn't yet name, restorative. I would come home from work exhausted, put down my bag, change my clothes, and feel a specific tension leave my body, a tension I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was optional. That was the first crack in the wall between my two countries. Once you notice that you feel better in one country than the other, you start to resent the border. You start to wonder why the border exists at all. And you start to feel the cost, every single morning when you cross it, of pretending you don't have another home. The cost, for me, showed up as symptoms I hadn't connected to the border at first. I was tired all the time. I got sick more often than seemed reasonable for a person in his early 20s. I had trouble concentrating at work. I had a persistent low-grade sadness that no amount of exercise or sleep could fully lift. I went to a doctor and got a clean bill of health that did not match how I felt at all. I went to a therapist, finally, after months of putting it off because a coworker mentioned in passing that her therapist had helped her through a hard year, and something about the casualness of the way she said it made me realize that seeing a therapist was not a confession of failure, but a normal thing that adults did. That therapist, whose name I won't use, but who I will always be grateful to, was the first person I ever told. I mean, the first person ever in my whole life that I told. It took me 3 sessions to get the words out, and when I did, I was crying so hard I couldn't finish sentences, and she just sat there and waited, and when I was done, she said, "Thank you for trusting me with this, and let's see what we can learn together." She didn't tell me who I was. She didn't tell me what to do. She just asked me questions, week after week, that I had been afraid to ask myself. Questions like, when do you feel most like yourself? When do you feel least? What are you afraid will happen if you tell the people you love? What are you afraid will happen if you don't? Slowly, over months, then years, I began to answer those questions, not to her so much as to me. I began to understand the difference between who I actually was and who I had learned to imitate in order to survive a childhood in which imitation had felt safer than authenticity. I began to understand that the cross-dressing, so-called, that I had done in secret since I was 12 had not been a symptom of dysfunction. It had been a small, private way of keeping something inside me alive when I did not yet have permission to let it live in daylight. I began to understand that I had a lot of choices ahead of me, and that not all of those choices had to be made at once, and that I was allowed to move at my own pace as long as I kept moving. Around this time, I made a decision I want to be honest about because it's not a decision that gets talked about much in stories like this, and I think its absence from those stories does a disservice to people who might be listening in a situation similar to the one I was in. The decision was this. I decided that whatever I did next, I was not going to do it in a way that betrayed the people who loved me. I don't mean I was going to hide who I was in order to keep them comfortable. I mean I was not going to lie to them, and I was not going to spring anything on them, and I was not going to disappear from their lives and reinvent myself in a way that shut them out. I owed them, at minimum, the chance to try to understand. Not because I owed them my identity, which no one owes anyone, but because they had loved me honestly for 2 decades, and I was going to love them honestly back, even in the middle of a change that was going to be hard on them. This might sound obvious, and I hope it does, but I know it isn't, because I have watched other people in situations like mine handle it in ways that hurt everyone involved unnecessarily. I have seen people vanish and reappear as strangers. I have seen people use their own difficult truth as a hammer to break relationships they had grown to resent. I have seen people demand instant acceptance from parents who had been given no time to catch up. I understand why. Fear does things to us. Long-held pain does things to us. I don't judge any of those people because I very nearly became each one of them in turn. But I made a promise to myself in that therapist's office that when I started telling my family, I was going to give them the same patience I had needed for myself. I was going to give them the same room to be confused, to grieve a version of me they thought they knew, to say the wrong thing at first and then correct it. I was going to give them time. Because I had needed time. 20 years of it. It seemed unfair to demand that they catch up in a week. I told Marin first. It was on a phone call on a Tuesday night, and I hadn't planned it, though I had rehearsed a version of it in my head for months. She was telling me about a coworker who had done something petty at her office, and I was laughing at the right parts. And then during a lull, I heard myself say, "Hey, can I tell you something?" She said, "Of course." I said, "I don't know how to say it." She said, "Take your time." And I did. I took my time. I said things haltingly and out of order. I said I had been struggling for a long time with who I was. I said the words I had been afraid to say to anyone I was related to. I said I didn't know exactly what came next, but that I couldn't keep pretending and that I wanted her to know because she was my sister and because she had always been the first person I felt safe around, and I needed the first person I told in the family to be someone I trusted with my life. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to panic. And then she said, "Okay." And then she said, "Thank you for telling me." And then she said, "I love you." And then she cried and I cried, and we stayed on the phone for another hour, not really saying much, just being on the phone together, which turned out to be all I actually needed. She wasn't perfect about it in the weeks that followed. She used the wrong words sometimes. She asked questions that, looking back, were probably a little clumsier than she meant them to be. But she showed up. She sent me articles. She apologized when she got things wrong, and she got better. She was, and is, a good sister. Telling my parents was harder and it took longer, and I want to be careful not to compress it into a neat little scene because it wasn't neat. It was months of small conversations. It was a Thanksgiving where I said one sentence at the kitchen sink to my mother and she said one sentence back, and then we both went into the dining room and finished the meal. It was a Christmas where I said a few more sentences and my father left the room and my mother came out to the porch where I was sitting and held my hand without saying anything for maybe 40 minutes. It was a spring where my father called me on a Tuesday and said, "I've been reading." He didn't say what he'd been reading, but I understood, and I told him I loved him, and he said, "I love you too, kid," and neither of us knew what to do with the conversation after that. So we talked about the garage door for a while, and then we hung up. That's how it happened. Not in a single dramatic scene. Not in an explosion. In dozens of small, awkward moments in which 2 generations of people who loved each other tried very hard to find the words. Some of those moments were painful. My mother, in one of the harder ones, said something she later apologized for, something about how she was scared she was going to lose me, and I understood, and I still had to sit alone in my car afterward for a while before I could drive home. My father, in another moment, said he didn't understand and wasn't sure he ever would, but that he was going to keep trying, and I told him that was more than a lot of people got, and I meant it. I want to be honest with you, listener, about how hard those conversations were, because I don't want to give you the impression that any part of this was easy or clean. It wasn't. It took years. But it was, and I say this without exaggeration, worth every uncomfortable minute, because on the other side of those years is a relationship with my parents that is truer than the one I had before, even though the one I had before was already loving. Love and honesty are not the same thing. You can have one without the other for a long time. But when you finally have both, you realize how much you were missing when you only had one. Work was its own chapter. I stayed at that publishing job for a couple more years, and then I moved to a different company where nobody had ever known me by any other version of myself, and I began, cautiously, to show up as me. Not dramatically. I didn't make an announcement. I just started, day by day, aligning the outside of me with the inside.
I wore what felt right.
I asked to be called by the name I had chosen, which is not Adrian, by the way, but close enough that I use Adrian here because it holds the same feeling for me. I answered questions patiently when people asked them and set limits gently when people asked ones they had no right to ask. Most of my coworkers were fine. A couple were not. One of them made a comment during a meeting that I could tell was designed to test me, and I remember taking a breath and saying in a very level voice, I'd rather focus on the agenda, and moving on. That was harder than it sounds. Every fiber of me wanted to cry, or to lash out, or to leave the room. But I stayed and I moved on, and afterward my manager pulled me aside and said, that was well handled, and if it happens again I want to know. It didn't happen again from that person, though other things happened from other people, and I learned, slowly, how to be my own advocate without letting other people's discomfort become my emergency. I want to talk about mistakes because I've made a lot, and I think stories like this can flatten out into a shape where the narrator is always the wise one, and everyone else is the obstacle, and that's not honest. I have been unfair to people. I once cut off contact with an old friend from home because I was afraid he wouldn't understand, without ever giving him the chance to try, and I found out years later that he had asked after me repeatedly and would have shown up for me if I'd let him. I owe him an apology that I have written and rewritten and still not sent, and I am working up to it as I record this. I have snapped at my mother for using an old word when she was clearly trying her best and just needed one more reminder. I have, in the deepest darkness of some of the harder years, been dishonest with the doctor about how I was actually doing because I was tired of being seen as fragile, and I know now that was dangerous, and I would never advise anyone else to do it. I have hurt people. Not because I was a villain, but because I was scared, and scared people hurt each other, sometimes without meaning to. Part of growing up, for me, has meant learning to sit with the fact that discovering who you are does not exempt you from responsibility for how you treat other people while you're figuring it out. In fact, it makes that responsibility more important, not less, because the more you understand your own pain, the less excuse you have for creating it in others. I say all this not to punish myself, but to be truthful, because I think anyone considering this kind of journey deserves to know that self-knowledge is not a moral shield. It's a moral tool. What you do with it is what matters. There were also, alongside the mistakes, small mercies I try to remember when I get discouraged. There was a stranger on a train once who noticed that I was crying quietly into a paperback and who, instead of asking what was wrong, just wordlessly passed me a small pack of tissues and went back to her own book. There was a barista at a coffee shop near my second apartment who learned my name and used it correctly from the very first day, without ever asking about anything else, and who saved me a specific muffin on Sunday mornings for 2 years because she'd noticed I liked it. There was a doctor who, when I finally worked up the courage to be honest with her about everything, said, I'm going to help you, and here is what we can do, and here is what will take more time, and here are the resources you should have had a long time ago. There was a coworker I barely knew who, after a hard day, said, are you okay? And when I said no, said, do you want to talk or do you want a break? And did not press when I said break. Small mercies. I have not forgotten a single one. I try to be that kind of small mercy for other people now because I know how much a single one of them can carry a person through a bad week. I want to talk briefly about the physical part of all this because I think listeners who are on a similar road sometimes want to hear about it, and listeners who are not on that road sometimes want to understand it. I made choices over the years about my body. Some of those choices were medical. Some were not. I made them slowly. I made them with doctors I trusted. I made them after a lot of thought and a lot of therapy and a lot of conversation with people who knew what they were doing. I am not going to itemize those choices here because they are mine and because different choices are right for different people and because I don't want anyone listening to walk away thinking my particular path is the correct path. The correct path is the one you walk carefully with good people around you at a pace that lets you keep checking in with yourself. What I will say is this. At some point in my mid-20s, I began to notice that my body was changing in ways that finally matched, rather than fought, the person I understood myself to be. It was slow. It was gradual. It was, at times, disorienting because I had spent so long being at war with my body that peace with it felt unfamiliar. I remember one specific morning, standing in my bathroom, looking in the mirror, and realizing that for the first time in maybe 15 years, I did not immediately want to look away. I stood there for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had crossed a finish line. I just felt, quietly, that the person in the mirror was someone I could live with. That's a small sentence, but it carried the weight of a lot of years. Not everyone I loved stayed. I want to be honest about that too, because the stories that pretend everyone comes around eventually are doing a disservice to people whose stories don't end that way. An aunt of mine, whom I had adored as a child, decided at a certain point that she could not be part of my life, and she said so in a letter that I read once and did not read again. I mourned her. I still do, sometimes. She had taught me how to make bread when I was 9. She had a way of laughing that sounded like a small bell. She is not in my life now, and I have made my peace with the fact that she may not be again, and if she is, it will be because she chooses to reach out, because I am not going to spend the rest of my life auditioning for people who have decided they cannot love the whole of me. That is not bitterness. That is boundaries. There is a difference. Bitterness carries the other person around inside you like a stone. Boundaries set the stone down and go on with your day. I am still learning to set stones down. I imagine I will be learning that for the rest of my life. On the other side of that loss, though, there have been unexpected additions. Friends I did not know I had have shown up in ways I couldn't have predicted. An old high school teacher wrote me a letter, years after I graduated, that I keep in a drawer and reread when I'm having a hard week. It doesn't say anything dramatic. It just says, I always thought there was more to you than you were letting anyone see, and I'm glad you're letting people see it now. A cousin I had barely spoken to since we were children reached out to say she'd read something I'd written and that she'd been thinking about her own life differently because of it. Strangers on the internet, when I began, very cautiously, to share small pieces of my story in small places, have sent me messages I still don't know how to answer. Family, I have learned, is not only who you are born to, it is also who chooses you back when you finally let them see who you are. I want to say something specifically to anyone listening who is at the beginning of a story like mine or who suspects they might be. I want to say it directly, and I want to say it gently. You do not have to have this figured out today. You do not have to have a label for yourself. You do not have to have a plan. You do not have to tell anyone until you are ready, and you do not have to justify the pace at which you are ready. If your circumstances are unsafe, you are allowed to move slowly and carefully to protect yourself, and there is no shame in that. Survival is a legitimate first step. But please, if you can, find one person to talk to, not a whole audience, not a public declaration. One person. It can be a therapist. It can be an anonymous helpline. It can be a friend you have carefully assessed as safe. One person who can hold a little of the weight for you so that you are not carrying it alone. Because you are not meant to carry it alone. Nobody is. And the loneliness of carrying it alone is, in my experience, the most dangerous part of the whole thing. Not the identity, not the questions, the loneliness. Find one person, and then, when you can, find another. I also want to say something to anyone listening who is on the other side of this, who has someone in their life beginning a journey like mine and who is scared or confused or grieving or angry. I want you to know that your feelings are real and that you are allowed to have them and that you should not, if you can help it, act on the sharpest ones in the direction of the person you love. Take those feelings to someone else. A therapist, a friend, a support group, a private journal. Do the work of processing them somewhere other than at your loved one's feet, because your loved one is likely already carrying more than you can see. And then, when you can come back to them, ask them questions with genuine curiosity.
Get their name right.
Get their words right. Apologize when you get them wrong. Show up again and again in small ways. That is what love looks like across a change. It doesn't look like understanding everything on day 1. It looks like still being there on day 1000, having learned a little more each day. My parents are still learning. I am still learning about them. That is how it is supposed to be. I'm going to try to bring this to some kind of close, because I've been talking for a long time, and I don't want to overstay my welcome. But before I do, I want to say what this whole story has taught me if I can compress it into something I can actually hand you. It has taught me that identity is not a costume, and it is not a performance, and it is not a rebellion. Identity is what remains when you stop performing everything else. It is the quiet thing underneath. It is the thing that made a 6-year-old stand outside a bedroom door and feel homesick for a place he had never been. It is the thing that made a 12-year-old borrow a cardigan and finally, briefly, breathe. It is the thing that made a 20-something sit in an apartment above a laundromat and feel, for the first time, at rest. It has taught me that self-acceptance is not a single decision but a practice, and that the practice is boring, in the best way, because it is made mostly of small, repeated, unglamorous acts. Getting up, eating breakfast, going to work, being kind to a coworker, calling your mother, not lying in the small ways that people so often lie about who they are.
Doing it again the next day.
That is what a life is. That is what a life becomes, when you finally stop spending so much of it in disguise. It has taught me that other people's discomfort with your existence is not, ultimately, your responsibility to solve, though it is often your responsibility to navigate with grace. It has taught me the difference between compassion and self-erasure. Compassion says, I understand this is hard for you, and I will be patient. Self-erasure says, I will become smaller and quieter so you don't have to feel anything difficult. Compassion is love. Self-erasure is a slow way of disappearing. I spent a lot of years confusing the two. I try not to anymore. It has taught me that gratitude is a survival skill. There are days still when the old sadness comes back, and on those days I make myself list things. The heat in my apartment, the tea in my mug, even when I forget to drink it, Marin's laugh, my mother's handwriting, a specific kind of afternoon light in the fall, the barista and the muffin, the stranger with the tissues, the teacher's letter in the drawer. When I list these things, I do not become instantly happy. That is not how gratitude works, but I become slightly more anchored. I remember that I am a person with a life, and that the life has good things in it, and that the good things are worth staying for. That is often enough to get me through the day. And it has taught me, finally, that the story of a life is not a straight line but a slow spiral, in which the same questions come back around at different altitudes, and you answer them a little better each time. When I was 6, standing outside my sister's door, I had a question I could not have named. When I was 12, in front of a mirror in a borrowed cardigan, I had the same question in a different voice. When I was 22, alone in a small apartment above a laundromat, I had it again, and I began, at last, to answer it. When I was 28, standing on a porch with my mother's hand in mine, I answered it a little more. Today, in my early 30s, with a lukewarm tea and a small apartment of my own and a life that is finally mine, I am still answering it. I expect I will be answering it in one way or another for the rest of my life. That is not a failure. That is what it means to be alive. If you take one thing from what I have said today, please let it be this. There is nothing wrong with you for wondering who you are. There is nothing wrong with you for taking a long time to figure it out. There is nothing wrong with you for needing help. There is nothing wrong with you for making mistakes along the way, provided you keep trying to do better. Be honest when you can. Be safe when you can't. Find one person, then another. Move at your own pace. Do not use your pain as a weapon against people who love you imperfectly. Do not accept from anyone being loved as less than who you are.
Set stones down when you can.
Carry the ones you must lightly. And remember that the small, quiet person in the mirror, the one whose shoulders finally dropped, is not a stranger and never was. That person is you waiting. You are allowed to go meet them. You are allowed to bring them home. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.